As the president of the UFC, Dana White deserves a lot of credit for popularizing the sport of mixed martial arts. Of course, he has been known to make a few mistakes, and on occasion, even lie from time to time. With that in mind, here are some of Dana White's biggest lies. Number 10. The Reebok Deal. When Dana White says that something is going to be good for the fighters, what he really means is that the thing in question is going to be very good for the UFC. And if the UFC grows because of it, then maybe the fighters will benefit. The issue with the infamous Reebok deal wasn't so much the uniforms themselves or the low bonuses that the fighters were paid for wearing them. The problem was that virtually every fighter lost thousands of dollars in regular sponsorship deals due to their inability to wear custom shorts. Hundreds of fighters felt the negative side effect of losing out on potential sponsors.
Fighters can't have independent sponsors when they walk into the cage now, and financially it seems to be a huge disaster for the fighters.
I lost a lot of money with sponsors.
So, despite what the UFC president originally claimed, the Reebok deal, or the Venom deal for that matter, were not actually good for the fighters. Number 9. The money fight. The UFC has often said that it will never co-promote and that they will never allow a fighter to compete in another sport while under contract. These things were written into UFC law so clearly that fighters would rarely try to look at potential opportunities outside of the promotion. However, when Conor McGregor burst onto the scene and proved himself to be a next-level pay-per-view draw, Dana White had a change of heart. Originally, White was adamant that a boxing fight between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor would never happen. Of course, when the fight materialized in 2017, Dana himself was standing on the podium as a co-promoter, introducing his fighter for a press conference in a sport that was most certainly not mixed martial arts.
The notorious Conor McGregor!
Number 8. Pride never dies. When the UFC took ownership of the legendary Japanese promotion Pride at the height of its fame, it stood as a merger between the two primary powers in mixed martial arts. Dana, at the time, claimed to be a fan of Pride and promised the fans that it, like Strikeforce a few years later, would remain intact, serving as an affiliated promotion with its own place in the MMA world.
Strikeforce is gonna continue to run business as usual.
Unfortunately, that's not what happened. As soon as the UFC took over, Pride and Strikeforce were basically dissolved there and then, with many of their rostered fighters jumping over to the UFC. Dana White has shown himself to be a pretty ruthless businessman when it comes to his competitors, but on this occasion, he wasn't exactly honest to the UFC's fans. Number 7. GSP will never fight again. The funny thing about Dana White saying that a fighter doesn't want to fight or will never fight again is that sometimes it turns out to be more of a taunt than anything else. But in the case of George St-Pierre, it was quite hard to know why Dana was distancing the promotion from what was set to be a truly massive comeback. GSP hadn't fought in 3.5 years, and after a career spent in the welterweight division, he appeared to be readying himself for a run as a middleweight, a major departure from his relatively safe approach to his prime career. But even when it seemed certain that St-Pierre was coming back, Dana wouldn't budge, telling the fans that no such return was happening.
George St-Pierre will not fight again. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. George St-Pierre is done. He is retired. He will not fight again.
Have he told you that?
He doesn't have to tell me that.
Was he trying to misdirect us or help himself at the negotiations table? Whatever the case, it was clear something fishy was afoot. Number 6. 90% mental. Dana White is the type of guy who is more than willing to give his biggest stars some leniency here and there. But if there's one thing that he has no tolerance for, it's fighters who pull out of events with excuses that just don't cut it. Whether or not Amanda Nunes was actually too sick to compete at UFC 213 is anyone's guess. But when she ultimately pulled out of her title fight with Valentina Shevchenko just a few hours prior, to say it didn't sit well with Dana would be putting it lightly. The UFC president pretty much buried Amanda Nunes there and then, promising the world that she would never headline a UFC event again.
I mean, does that concern you moving forward? Like, can I put this woman in the main event slot? And
Yeah, I won't do that again.
In his own words, her issues were 10% physical and 90% mental, and that if she really wanted to fight, she could have.
I think that it was, 90% mental and maybe 10% physical.
Jump forward just 2 months later to UFC 215, and guess who the headliner was? It's pretty safe to say that Dana White proved himself wrong in record time on this one. Number 5. The funky one. Ben Askren and Dana White's relationship over the years has been pretty rocky, to say the least. Not only has Ben Askren never been afraid to speak his mind and criticize the UFC,
The biggest benefit is not having to work for Dana White. That guy's a freaking scumbag.
but his status as one of the greatest fighters to never compete in the promotion made him a pretty big what if. However, when he decided to leave Bellator in 2013, specifically so he could join up with the UFC, Dana decided then and there that he didn't want to sign him. Whether it was because of his past comments or even just his wrestling-heavy style, Dana opted not to make an offer. Instead, he told the media that Ben Askren just didn't want to fight in the UFC.
Listen, you don't have to be my best friend to fight here. We don't have to like each other to do business. That kid does not want to fight the best in the world. I promise you that.
This, of course, wasn't exactly truthful. Askren had left his home at Bellator just so he could finally challenge the best fighters in the world. And though he would eventually make it to the UFC several years later, he was well past his prime at that point. Number 4. Jeremy Stephens' arrest. Understandably, the UFC and Dana White will often go to great lengths to make sure a scheduled bout goes down as planned. However, this next one was clearly beyond saving, something Dana White was reluctant to admit. Back in 2012, just hours before Jeremy Stephens was set to face Yves Edwards, he was arrested on assault charges for an incident that took place a year prior. That news alone should have been enough for the UFC to announce his removal from the card. However, despite his arrest and being held without bail, Dana White insisted that the fight was still moving forward as planned. The UFC didn't even announce its cancellation until the very last second, when they were actually on air for the event.
Yves Edwards was told 35 minutes before the main event.
Of course, anyone following the news that morning knew this outcome was inevitable, despite Dana White saying otherwise. Number 3. Women's MMA. One of the most controversial comments made by Dana White was, of course, his infamous statement on the possibility of seeing women fight in the UFC. At present, there are a total of 4 women's divisions in the promotion, which includes stars like Valentina Shevchenko and Amanda Nunes. Of course, back in 2011, after being questioned by a TMZ reporter about seeing the UFC open their doors to female athletes, Dana's response was a pretty conclusive no.
When are we gonna see women in the UFC, man?
Never.
Anytime soon? Never?
What he didn't anticipate, however, was the emergence of one of the biggest draws in UFC history in the form of Ronda Rousey. Her arrival on the Strikeforce scene caused a pretty rapid change of tone from Dana White, and the rest, as they say, is history. Number 2. Not for sale. Okay, so we're not going to go too hard on Dana White for this one. As the UFC was starting to make a real dent on the mainstream world, it was only natural that its market value would skyrocket, especially when they had a crossover star like Conor McGregor at its helm. So when rumors began to circulate about a potential takeover from WME-IMG, fans began to wonder whether the UFC was headed for a major change in ownership. Dana, without blinking, repeatedly told the media that no such sale was going ahead, and that the Fertitta brothers were still in charge.
Rumors are swirling around that the UFC is for sale. What is the latest on that?
The UFC is not for sale.
Naturally, few actually believe this, and shortly after, the promotion was sold for $4.2 billion, with Dana White staying on board as the company's president. Number 1. Deontay Wilder money. If there has been one constant throughout Dana White's negotiations over the years, it's his tendency to try and change the narrative surrounding the fighters he's dealing with, often pointing to them as being unreasonable. One such occasion came up when Jon Jones was first talking about a move up to heavyweight. According to Jones himself, he was simply looking for an increase in pay that better reflected his worth as a pay-per-view draw. In response, Dana White told the media that he was asking for Deontay Wilder money, $30 million to be exact, in an attempt to discredit his actual argument for better pay.
Told my lawyer he wants what Deontay Wilder was paid.
25 million?
I think it was 30 million.
Jon Jones immediately denied this, sharing his side of the story in a series of tweets. The simple fact of the matter is that the UFC prioritizes their slice of the pie over everything, and if Dana has to bury a superstar to ensure his company's success, that can, sadly, happen on occasion. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.